Good evening and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got a really interesting author to introduce you to tonight with a very compelling book about a true love story of her grandparents during World War II. Michelle Brown is our guest tonight. She's an elementary school teacher. She's a mother. She's an author. She's had a passion for writing since the early years of her life, 9 years old, actually. And she was inspired by the work of literary legends like Margaret Lawrence, Margaret Atwood, Alexandra Dumas, Harper Lee, John Irving, and Essie Hinton. And now she has written this book about Vivian and Thomas, her grandparents, Charles and Violet, and they fell in love during World War II. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
My pleasure to have you. So tell me, what inspired you to write a novel centered around a true love story of your own grandparents, and also including a lot of the true life events of World War II?
I think probably first and foremost, my grandmother would share these really romantic stories about her and my grandfather and how they had met. And, it just was, one of those things where you kind of just, you sit and you listen to your grandmother telling the stories. And I just always was just so inspired by this romantic relationship and this romance that they had together and the love that I grew up seeing. And with that passion of writing, it just sort of evolved to, I would tell people the story about my grandparents. They're like, oh, that would make a really good story. That would make a really good story. So I thought, you know what? Let's do it. I'm going to write it. I'm going to write this story.
Now, the main characters are Vivian and Thomas, and your grandparents are Charles and Violet.
Yes.
Tell me, is it a true story? Is it almost true story? What's the comparison?
So there are a lot of actual true events that I've been able to mix into the story. There's some creative license, of course, to fill in some blanks that I was not sure about the details of, or just to adjust the timeline a little bit to make things fit a little bit more neatly. But for the most part, there's quite a bit of fact in there.
Can you give us a little synopsis of what happens? Why is it so romantic, and why is World War II woven into the story?
So it starts with how they met, which was at a wedding and during World War II. And so that's sort of the basis of the whole beginning half of the story is where they meet and how they meet. And so my grandmother was in the British military. She was a communications clerk. And my grandfather was an RSM for the 8th Recce, which was, if there's military people listening at all, they'll know that the 8th Recce was quite the unit. So first in, last out sort of group of people. And they just had this incredible connection immediately. From the moment they met, it was like, darts flew through the air and they just were connected by like a soul connection almost. And it just sort of flows from there with sort of some of the events of the war and where that sort of lands in their personal timeline as well. The birth of my mother and some things around that. And then, after the war, realizing that there just really wasn't a good future there for really anybody, and him deciding to bring her back to Canada and building a life here.
What's an RSM?
Oh, I'm sorry. Regimental Sergeant Major. It's the highest non-officer rank that you can be in the military.
And was he in uniform when they met and the sparks flew?
Yes, absolutely. That may have had something to do with it.
She liked the man in the uniform.
Yes. Yeah.
So you hear these stories all the time about love at first sight. How did they describe it? How did your grandmother describe it?
She would describe it as from his point of view and what he had said. And so his words were that he was standing up at the front of the church and he looked down and there's this absolute, to him, angel floating down the aisle as the maid of honor. And he just looked at her and thought, holy smokes, that's her. And, she would tell that story and she'd have this smile on her face and, she'd be very wistful and you could see that she was going back to that moment. And it was just this really beautiful story. So
Now, your grandmother told you the stories. Did your grandfather tell you the stories as well?
unfortunately, he passed when I was 6. So I didn't get a lot of information from him about the story. But definitely she shared a lot of their moments along the way.
And how old was your grandmother when she passed?
She was 87.
So she had a good long life.
She sure did.
What a fascinating story. And tell us a little bit about how the real events of World War II sort of are woven into the story.
So it was really important to me to make sure that the story was authentic. So there was a lot of research that I did, which was part of why it took so long to write, because I wanted to make sure it was correct. So I was able to get a hold of my grandfather's military records. And so that showed all the places that he had been, the courses that he took. There's a lot of detail in those records. And then the regimental war diary was gifted to me by somebody. And it is literally the day-by-day accounting of where the regiment was and what they were doing. Some days it would just have an entry of sunny, clear skies kind of thing. And then other entries, there's a lot of detail of, of a battle going back and forth and changing positions and things like that. And my grandfather's mentioned by name in that. So between his records and the war diary and doing research on the history of the war itself as well, I was able to take some of those stories that I had been told and make connections to events in the war. And so it was really important to me to make sure that that was as true as I could possibly make it, and that it made sense as well. So for the the timelines for the characters themselves, and where they would actually be, and did it even make sense to be saying this in the story? One of the other stories that I grew up being told was about my mother's birth, and my grandmother going into premature labor because there had been a bombing in London, as there was frequently bombings in London, and this put her into premature labor. And my grandfather at the time was in France, and the Eighth Recce had been brought over after D-Day, and they were part of the group that was trying to push through to Caen, the village of Caen and Falaise, because the Allies had gotten off the beaches and then they got stalled quite horribly when they reached Caen and Falaise, and these were critical points for reclaiming some strength in the war. And so at the end of that particular battle, he sat down and he wrote a letter to my grandmother saying, I'm okay. You've probably heard that there's been quite a mix over here, and I am okay. And I feel like Wee Vi has been born. And he always referred to my mom as Wee Vi because it was my grandmother was Vi and she was Wee Vi. And she had been. The date on the letter was correct. And so being able to connect and look at that research and know that he was someplace in a battle, and that that it was a significant battle. The Eighth Recce were actually given battle honors for that particular battle. And because I was able to do that, I feel like it added a lot more depth to the story, that it actually was true, that it actually was something that happened to both of them. And it's sort of that part of the book kind of goes back and forth between the two of them, where she's in this battle to give birth to my mother, and he's in the battle trying to also stay alive. So, yeah.
Did you have many letters? What a treasure that you had this letter.
So the letter itself, I don't have. It was the story from my grandmother, but I was able to make those connections through his records, and what she had shared with me.
So let's roll back. He saw this angel walking
Yeah.
down the aisle. What was the first move?
Well, the first move was just sort of like at the reception after, and going in to secure his space, I think, secure the perimeter. And right by her side and chatting her up.
If she was the maid of honor, was he the best man or an usher, or
Yeah,
why was he at the front of the
yeah,
state, in front of that
yeah.
church?
He was the best man, and they had never met up until that moment, oddly enough.
Now you said going back to Canada. Was he from Canada originally, or was he
Yeah,
in
so
the
he
Canadian
was
Army?
Canadian. Yeah, he was a Canadian. He is a Smith from Smith Falls, actually.
And
Yeah.
so was he in a Canadian Army unit, or was he did he join the British
Yes.
Army?
No, so he was in the Canadian military. It was the the second division for Canadian division, and then the eighth recce within that. So he started off actually in the fourth recce reconnaissance unit, sorry, and then he moved into the eighth reconnaissance unit and moved his way up and became a regimental sergeant major with them. Yeah.
And how long did he spend in the army in England and then in France?
He joined up right at the beginning, pretty close to the beginning of the war. And he stayed until he was actually there during some occupation and helping to sort of reboot things for people over there and rebuild things for people. And then came back to England. They tried to kind of make it work there, but there just wasn't work. And there was literally no place for people to live. 1 in 3 homes in England, in London specifically, had been destroyed. So there were a lot of people that were homeless and jobless because factories were gone and all of that as well. So there just wasn't the prospects for them in England that they had in Canada. And he knew he had connections back here, obviously. Canada was not impacted nearly the same way that England had been. Things were much more fortuitous here. And so they came back and they settled down in Toronto. And he ended up working for the TTC in Toronto as a bus driver and subway driver. And they built a home in Willowdale. She actually drew the plans for that house herself, and then they built that home, and then they ended up in Aurora. And that's where I sort of end up coming into the picture, is at that stage.
And inquiring minds want to know, when did they meet? When did they marry? When was your mother born?
So my mom was born, she was actually born in England, as was one of my uncles. The rest of my aunts and uncles were born here in Canada. They met in 1940, I believe. And my mom was born a couple years later, my uncle a couple years after that. And then they came to Canada on the Britannica, actually. And they came across over Christmas holidays. So their fare, one of the documents they do have is a menu from the ship that has the names of the people that they sat with written on it. It's really quite cute. And the date was December 28th, 1949, that they came
What a great
across.
story, and it must have been a real treasure to write it. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Michelle Brown Matthews, the author of a book about her grandparents and their love story, and maybe ask her to read us some of the story. It sounds lovely. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Michelle Brown. She is an author, and she's written her debut novel called Love Always. It's a story about how her grandparents met and married and lived during World War II. He was a Canadian military person in England during World War II, and sounds like a great story about how they met for the first time when he was the best man and she was the maid of honor, and it was love at first sight. So, that must have been a wonderful story and great story to hear over and over and over again when you were growing up. But you want to share with us a part that you say is a little bit dramatic, where your mother was being born and your grandmother went into labor. Is that correct?
Sure, I would love to. Thank you.
Please do so.
The small garden had not suffered despite Vivian's not so green thumb. She looked around her with a sense of pride. Her brother Bryant had managed to plant and grow quite a nice assortment of vegetables in her little patch in the rear of her parents' home in Tottenham. He was teaching her how to care for the plants and gave her a small patch to work with under his supervision, of course. He was a very patient teacher. The vibrant greens of the plants clashed with the stark gray, brown, and black scorched walls of houses and buildings around them. They had been charred from fire and ruined at the hand of the incessant bombing by Germany. Peas clung thickly to the vine and strung across some sticks. She snapped one off and placed it in her mouth. It was crisp and sweet. She closed her eyes as she crunched happily on the shell and threw to the sweet round peas inside. Her belly rolled and stretched. She reached down to rub it, massaging her baby bump with delicate and affectionate strokes. Her child, Thomas's child, responded to the happy calm of their mother. It didn't matter to Vivian if the child was a boy or a girl, so long as they were healthy and well. They would be moving to a house in Farnham in just a few more weeks. He had wanted her to be safe, and New London would become an ever-increasing target for the Luftwaffe and the VK buzz bombs. He couldn't bear the idea of her being hurt, and with her carrying his child, it was even more crucial that Vivian be kept safe. The frequency of the bombings had been increasing as of late, leading many to speculate about an impending attack on the shores of Southampton. In fact, the frequency had grown to at least one bomb every hour. Most were taken down by the anti-aircraft guns and the barrage balloons, but far too many reached their mark. The scream of an air siren broke through the tranquility of the garden. She was momentarily unsure where she was or what the significance was of that noise. Even before the siren reached its peak, she could hear the drone, the buzzing of the VK bombs. How much longer would it last? A sickening dread hit her. While they could be heard, there was usually no threat. It was when they stopped making noise that they became a true danger. That was when they were dropping from the sky, seeking their target, seeking to destroy roads, bridges, homes, seeking to take lives and evoke terror. She could hear the drone of the bombs and the siren blending in with the anti-aircraft guns. The sounds blurred, becoming a syncopated orchestra of cataclysm. Terror lifted in her chest and her heart pounded. She began to run towards the house. She needed to get inside for her greatest safety, to get away from the potential shrapnel of crumbling walls and shattering glass. The risk of the house being hit was less than the risk of something around her being destroyed and her being without cover. As she ran towards the house, her father appeared at the door and calling to her, "Viv, come!" At that moment, she lost her footing and stumbled. She saw her father's face drop as she fell forward onto her swollen stomach. "Viv," he cried, running towards her, but there was no chance of reaching her in time. Vivian had already hit the ground belly first with a horrifying thud. He helped her up and carried her half carried her into the house. Her heart was pounding in her ears. She could barely hear her father, but understood he was telling her to hide under the bed. He helped her down onto the floor, but she couldn't fit. That was when she felt the warmth on her legs. She looked at her father as she touched inside her thigh, and he went ashen when he saw the blood on her hand.
The bombing of England is obviously something that there's been lots of stories written about. Were there other historical events that were occurring that you sort of focused on in the book?
There is. So the bombings themselves, there's a section of the story with her and one of her friends when she is in her clerk role. Her brigade was actually given a commendation because during a particularly bad bombing, they all stayed at their post. And so I include that, and I have that in the timeline as the beginning of the actual Blitz, which was September 7th. It's often referred to as Black Saturday. And with that, it was 56 days of straight bombing on London with no break. And then it continued in a very strong way until the following May. So London and well, England, but in London very particularly lost in those first 56 days, about 30,000 people.
30,000 people.
30,000 people, most of whom were civilians. Yeah.
Um, war has some sensitive topics. Did you cover any of those, and how was that to write about?
One of the sensitive topics, and I felt that it was really important to touch on, were the concentration camps. We live in a world where, we fight really hard against hate, and it seems to manage to resurface an awful lot. So to me, I thought it was very important to make sure that I didn't gloss over the fact that there were these atrocities happening. And at the same time, I didn't want to turn them into something gruesome either and be disrespectful in that way either. Um, I was given an absolute gift of being able to interview an amazing lady named Eva Olson, and she is a survivor of the Holocaust. And so she gave me some permission to include her story in my story. And she was a survivor of Auschwitz. She was a survivor of Bergen-Belsen. And that's where she actually was liberated by Canadian and British soldiers, and her life literally saved by those soldiers. She was dying of typhoid. And I wanted to make sure that she was represented in the story. And I wanted to make sure that all of those people were represented to some degree within the story. She went on from that horrific experience to meet and marry a gentleman from Switzerland. And they too also moved here to Canada. She lives in Bracebridge. She's, I believe, 97 now. And she used to do talks at schools and other arenas about anti-bullying and anti-hate. So this person who went through some of the most absolute, obscene, horrific events that you could, survive as a human being, instead of deciding to hate anybody, decided that there was no place for that in her heart. So I really love that message. I think that's something that we need to hear more of. And that's why I really wanted to make sure that she was someplace in my story as well.
Do you know if your grandfather had any role in liberating concentration camps?
His regiment was part of liberating Westerbrook. I have that in the documents, and I know that there was a second location that they were part of, but it doesn't say specifically which one. So again, taking some creative license, I placed him in Bergen-Belsen during that particular liberation.
What what do you think your grandmother would have thought if she read your book?
I think she would probably giggle and think, oh my goodness, I sound so impressive. Because she was just one of the most modest people in the whole world. She had no idea how beautiful she was. She had no idea just how clever she was. What a calming, loving figure she was to so many people. And she's just blissfully unaware of it, you know? And it was probably one of the most charming and beautiful things about her was that she was all of those things. And she didn't do it because she wanted to be noticed. She just did it because that's who she is.
The picture of her that you sent me,
Mhm.
my gosh, she looks so young.
She was. She was very young. She was only in her early 20s.
She looks like she could be 16 or 17. It's
Yeah.
incredible how young. Your grandfather does look incredibly dashing.
Yes. He was a little bit older. He's 13 years older than her. So he was a very dashing fellow.
What an
My
incredibly wonderful
always
love story.
referred,
And I
sorry.
apologize.
My nan always referred to him as being a very smart looking soldier.
An incredible love story. I really appreciate you sharing it with the whole world through reading your
Yeah.
book. Tell us, what's it like writing about someone so close to you?
Um, One of the things that I really enjoyed, excuse me, the most about all of this, excuse me, was sort of being able to relive those moments again with my grandparents. Um, and it was like they were here again when I was writing. I could feel their presence and I could almost hear their voices sharing the stories with me again and being like, oh, don't forget this part. So it was really touching for me to be able to write it and just genuinely feel deeply connected to them again.
I want to hear the story, the part about when they first met, or maybe the first date. Can we take a break and can you read us one of those two experiences that
Absolutely.
I think it'd
Yeah.
be kind of fun. Well, we're going to take a break. We're going to be back in 2 minutes. We've got Michelle Brown talking about her debut novel. What's the title of the book?
Love always.
Love Always, and where can one get it?
It is on Amazon, and but if you prefer to support your local bookstore, they can order it in through Ingram Sparks.
We're going to take a break and be back chatting about Love Always in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Michelle Brown. She is the debut novelist of a romantic story called Love Always, a story about her grandparents and how they met during World War II. Michelle, romance. Why did you choose to write romance, historical romance, which I think would be pretty challenging?
I think it sort of just evolved into that it was going to be historical romance because of the context of the time that I was writing about, and sort of needing to have those bits and pieces from that time period fit into the story. I could have transported them into a different time period. I could have transported them into the current time period, but I think their actual story, it wouldn't fit or align with today's norms. You know, World War II and people, specifically women in that time period, the world was a very different place for people back then. You know, women didn't even have the right to, excuse me, to have a bank account of their own without their father or their husband's permission until 1974. So, you know, reflecting back on what their relationship was and the opportunities that were available and things like that, I think if I were to put them into present day, the story wouldn't ring as true or as compellingly as it does in their actual timeline. And I think, you know, during war, people don't know if they're going to live or die to see the next day. And so their mindset is very different. They live for today. They love for today. And I think that they feel things very intensely for fear that they may never feel something ever again.
To in that environment decide to get married, to get pregnant, to have a child. It's really an investment in the future that you just don't know is going to be there.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, there's actually some scandal around the relationship. So
Oh, well, you got to share that now. That sounds fascinating.
so they actually were not married. Um, that was not something that ended up happening, and it actually never did end up happening.
They
Which
never got married.
never got married. So, at risk of giving too many spoiler alerts, he actually already was married. Mhm. So some scandal.
Oh, you got to tell us.
Well, he doesn't reveal that for quite a bit in the story. And I don't believe that he actually revealed that too early in the relationship either. So by the time she was aware, she was far too deeply into the whole thing and so in love that it just did not matter anymore. So, yes.
Oh, now I really want to read the book. Oh my gosh, this sounds fascinating.
Good.
Um, Can you read something, maybe something romantic about either how they first met or the first date or something like that?
Absolutely. I'm going to read a little bit of the chapter where they go out for the first time after they've met.
Okay, sounds wonderful. Oh my God, this is good.
Um, excuse me. The air was warm and light, and a light breeze playfully licked at Vivian's hair. A curl had come loose from under her cap and brushed across her forehead. She hummed cheerfully to herself as she walked along the path and wound through the park. The trees were full and lush, and the sun was still quite high, even though it was late afternoon. It danced on the leaves, making them sparkle in a way that was as joyful as she felt. As she walked, she saw couples holding hands and sitting close to each other on benches, gentle kisses, body touching. It made her blush as she thought of Thomas and touching or kissing him. The spout and body of a fountain near the entrance of the park sat crumbling and broken in large charred pieces. Miraculously, the basin at the bottom remained intact. It seemed to be a source of fun for families sitting beside it as their young son splashed in the water, oblivious to the missing head and torso of the statue that once stood on top. Before she even saw him, she became keenly aware of him. She sensed his presence, then heard his laughter. Full of mischief, she could picture his face before he even came into view. His twinkling blue eyes, his crooked smile and full lips. Vivian felt herself flush again, and her heart jolted when she finally laid eyes on the man. He was unaware of her and in the thick of a large group of children. They were chasing him, and Thomas deliberately slowed down so that they could catch him. They fell down in a clatter of howls and laughter. She watched him like that, loving the affection of those kids, finding joy in the simple pleasure of playing in a park amidst the rubble of a village that had been targeted for destruction. Thomas suddenly froze. He was on the ground, covered in giggling, out-of-breath children. His back was turned to her, but she knew that he had become aware of her presence. Her breath caught in her chest, and her pulse quickened. He rolled over, grinning from ear to ear, searching for her. He couldn't believe how beautiful she was. There was a quiet elegance about her. Her skin had a warm kiss from the sun, yet it looked like porcelain. He was caught in the moment as he breathed hard from playing with the kids and the emotions that hit him when he saw her. Her eyes shined brightly, like warm honey in new grass. He noticed the wisp of hair playing along her forehead. Well, there you are, he called to her as he climbed out of the muddle of children. He was out of breath and unable to offer more than a wry grin. The children tittered when they noticed how the two adults were looking at each other. They realized that their playtime was over in favor of the new company. See you again, sir, Freddie, a small blonde lad, shouted as he wandered off towards the swings. Thanks for playing with us. See you tomorrow? You bet. Next time I get a head start, Thomas laughed and ruffled the coal-black hair of Simon, who lingered back. He was probably 8 or 9 with pale skin and was covered in freckles. His strength was apparent despite the fact that he was slight and wry. Simon ran after his friends, smiling and waving. The rest of the children shouted their goodbyes, and Thomas grinned, promising to return for a rematch. He picked up a bag off the ground nearby, and he walked towards Viv. He took her in as he approached. She was so young and innocent looking, and her eyes, those eyes, wide and bright. Forgetting himself, he hugged her and kissed her. Flustered, she pushed him away and looked around to see if anyone had noticed. Her family was very conservative in that regard. Thomas, Vivian admonished. She smiled shyly. Shall we find a nice spot to eat? He gestured to the bag he'd picked up. That sounds lovely. She let him lead her to a small pond in the center of the park. As they walked, they talked about their days. She told him how it had been busy but calm, with lots of calls to be made and coordinated, but not with the urgency that they felt while under fire. He told her about his training they would be doing later in the week. Nothing of consequence. She shouldn't worry. It wasn't untrue. His regiment was doing training and driving through water and sandy terrain. Here's a good spot. Thomas opened the bag and pulled a blanket out for them to sit on. He laid it out and offered his hand to Vivian. Grasping it, she sat down and watched as he pulled out several small packets from the bag, each one wrapped to conceal the contents. The first, a large wedge of cheese. Viv gasped when she saw it. She knew that that alone had taken significant resources to procure. My goodness, Thomas, how in the world did you get all of this? The best is yet to come, he said. He grinned and ignored her question and pulled out a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. Her eyes widened and her mouth opened. My heavens, I don't believe it. It's too much. How did you? He cut her off, placing his finger on her lips. I have one chance to do this right the first time, he said, leaving his finger there. And I aim to sweep you off your feet, Miss Vivian Waltman. He caressed her cheek. One last thing. He pulled the last packet from the bag and handed it to her, nodding at her to open it as she looked at him, confused. What else could you possibly have? She opened the packet and gasped. The aroma reached her nose at the same time, and she beheld the smooth, rich brown squares. Chocolate. It had been a very long time since she had had chocolate.
What a romantic gentleman.
Mhm.
So I've got to ask you, you've teased us with a little bit of the difficult part of this, the scandal part of this relationship. How did you make the characters likable and relatable when there's a little bit of scandal involved?
Well, I think one of the things that makes them relatable is that they genuinely are or could be any of us. All of us are flawed people. We are perfectly imperfect, and they were perfectly imperfect, and they never pretended to be otherwise. Um, and I think as you read the story and you get to know the characters and you realize that they are deeply good people and they love each other and they love their family and they care about their friends and their community. And you realize that as flawed people, we sometimes make mistakes. We sometimes make choices that we shouldn't have. And it's what you decide to do with that afterwards and how you decide to stand up for yourself and for others after that. That really matters. And in the end, you know, they lived a really beautiful life together.
You said that you started to fall in love with writing when you were a young girl, age 8.
Yes.
But yet this is you, and you've spent time as an elementary school teacher, and yet this is your debut novel. Why did it take you so long to write?
I think a very big part of it was the research. There was a lot of research that I needed to do um, to make sure that I actually had my facts straight. But quite a long time ago, I shared what I was writing with someone, and they said, "Oh, you know, that's lovely, but it's really just a memento for you and your family, right? Like people aren't going to buy that story." Other people aren't going to be interested in that story. And so I paused for a very, very long time and did not write the story. Um, and then I realized a couple of years ago, um, so what? So what if it is just a memento for my family and myself? Um, but I don't think that that's actually what it's going to be. I think that the story resonates with a lot of people. I think that the story is a lot of people. And it's a lot of people's grandparents, and it's a lot of people's parents, and it's a lot of people themselves. And I think that, being able to be drawn in and connect with characters, a lot of the reviews that I've had is that people become very deeply emotionally connected to these 2 characters in the story, and that readers should apparently have Kleenex nearby while they read. Um, and it ends with the ending of her life. So it's definitely emotionally charged. And I'm very happy that I decided to go through with it and write the story after all.
Michelle Brown, thank you so much for sharing the story and your story with us. What are you working on now? What's next?
I'm still wrapping up a few things with the novel. I'm working on an audiobook version. And I also am working with a screenplay writer to adapt it for film. So those are some things that are coming up for this particular novel. Very excited for that. So if there are, movie producers or directors out there listening, please feel free to reach out. I am interested in hearing from you. And then after that, I have two books that are kind of fighting for first place to be next. And they're kind of side by side. One is a romantic, that's a little bit more of a dark romance with a stalker. And the other is the story of a man who lived a very full life, but with many regrets. And he passes away. And so the story is sort of told from his perspective as somebody who is already gone. So there's two voices in that story. There's his first person, and then there's the story as it relates to everybody else in the story. So those are the ones that are working on being next.
Fantastic. What your siblings or your children must have heard some of these stories. Have they read the book, and do they think it is authentic and true to the stories they heard?
Yes, they sure do. They definitely heard these same stories growing up. I was very proud to share all of those stories while I was growing up. And so when they were finally given a copy to read, they were very moved as well. So yeah, it was really, it's having the support of your children is definitely something that fills your heart. So it was a very proud mom moment as well. So yeah.
I am shocked at how popular, the Hallmark Channel is and Hallmark movies and things like this.
Yes.
Why is romance still of such interest to people as
Um,
a literary vehicle?
I think if you look at shows and novels like Bridgerton that turned into these massive successful series, or Outlander that was a book that was out for a long time before it managed to get to screen. And I think being able to be transported as a reader into a story where there is this beautiful loving connection between people, with lots of bumps along the way. I think the bumps along the way are what make it so compelling and interesting to readers, because they love to see that other people are flawed, that these made up characters are flawed. I think it helps us to appreciate ourselves more and appreciate potential relationships or the relationships that we have more, and to see that it doesn't have to be perfect to be amazing.
Michelle Brown, thank you for joining us. Remind us the name of the title of the book.
It's Love Always.
And where can one get it?
On Amazon, or if you want to support your local bookstore, you can go in and ask them to order it in through Ingram Sparks.
Any readings or anything like that coming up?
I have a book and Christmas fair November 24th in Barrie, and the Barrie Public Library does an author event on December 7th. And I don't have confirmed dates, but I have two Indigo chapter readings coming up as well.
Well, let us know. I want to come and hear the story live.
Perfect. I would love that.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Michelle Brown with her debut novel, Love Always. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. Even from Barrie, you can stream me online. That's our show. Good night, everybody. Thanks, Michelle.